Welcome back, lost travelers. Pour yourself something strong. Grab a blanket and sit a little closer to the screen, because tonight I have 4 eyewitness stories that will keep you awake for a few nights. I am the voice that collects the things that do not fit, and what I will tell you is based on reported encounters from people who still wake up sweating and listen to their dogs breathe. If you are drawn to the strange, to the borderline, and the almost human, you are in the right place. Disclaimer: some stories contain graphic descriptions and disturbing imagery. Use discretion and decide for yourself what is real. The night smelled like wet earth and dying leaves. Listen to the hum in the background and the faint creak that could be wind or could be something else breathing through the trees. Before we begin, like the video if you appreciate careful testimony, subscribe if you want more reports like these, and hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. Real or not, that decision is yours. Now, I will start by saying nothing overtly bad happened at first, at least not the kind of thing you would see on a headline. What changed was how ordinary things stopped making ordinary sense. When I first spoke with Mark, he sounded ordinary in a way that makes the details land harder. He lived in a single-story house with a small fenced backyard and 2 dogs named Roxy and Boone. His routine was precise to the point of boring. He worked nights at a warehouse, came home, made a sandwich, let the dogs out for a quick run, checked the trash cans, and then watched a show until his eyelids closed. He told me in a low voice, "I always lock the back gate at midnight. I wake up once at 3 to let them out if they need it." That night, he said the routine shifted into something else. He described the minute smells first. He said, "There was a sour thing on the edge of the yard, like someone had left fish to rot in a bag. It filled my nose and my eyes watered." He opened the back door and called, "Roxy, come on, and Boone, outside." And the dogs froze. They did not rush out. They pressed their faces to the threshold and sniffed as if learning a new word. Mark tried humor to break it. He joked, "Come on, you two, it is just the yard." But the words did not land. Boone whined, and Roxy put her head down. Mark shone his phone light across the grass and said, "There were 2 dips in the lawn, like someone had sat there a long time and not moved." He brushed the grass with his foot, and it felt colder than the air. He said, "I saw a pair of little lights under the deck, between the boards, like 2 buttons of wet glass. I knocked on the deck, and the lights did not move." He called his neighbor Jenna, who came over in slippers holding a cup of coffee, and they argued about raccoons. Jenna said, "It is probably a raccoon or a possum," but when she leaned over to check, she froze and said, "There is a smell like old meat." They tried to make jokes then, because that is what people do to keep fear at the edge of sense. Jenna muttered, "Maybe the neighbor threw away a pig," and Mark answered, "We would know, we would smell it earlier." Yet the dogs would not cross the threshold. At one point, a distant truck passed, and a breeze lifted something wet and metallic into the air. Mark told me their eyes stayed on that spot, like someone else was standing there. Conversation looped in the small yard in rounds of questions and half-answers. Mark asked, "Should we call animal control?" And Jenna said, "Do you want them to say it is nothing?" And Mark replied, "I do not know." He placed a chair near the door, and they both sat looking out. Boone leaned his head on Mark's knee and shuddered like he was cold. Roxy refused to move. The sense of small things rearranging was the first real anchor for dread. They checked the garbage cans, shook the cushions, pulled back boards, and still found nothing definitive. At dawn, Mark found an odd smear on the patio glass at chin height that looked like a nose had been wet against it. He photographed it and sent the picture to me. He said, "It was not soot, not dirt, not brown. It looked like oil with a heartbeat." He replayed how he felt, a stupid human wanting the world to be sensible. The dogs would not go out for 3 nights. People from the neighborhood came by names and faces that would show up across these tales. There was Louis, who smelled everything and declared it old. There was Miguel, who suggested they set a camera. There was Officer Ramirez, who said he would pass by, and there was Dr. Patel, the veterinarian, who examined the dogs and asked quietly if they had been around dead animals. Each person added a plausible explanation, and each explanation fell short. The backyard, the latch, the dog collar all became evidence in a slow and stubborn puzzle. The smell recurred like a chant. The hair on Mark's arms lifted whenever the light from the kitchen hit the yard just so. He told me in a whisper, "I thought about putting up motion lights, but I did not want to wake the whole block. I did not put out a camera because I did not want to make a spectacle. We were only trying to keep our dogs alive and our nights ordinary, but the ordinary was gone." The interaction with the neighbor Hank that followed reads like the map of denial. Hank came over and said, "I will sleep on the couch." And then, when the night stretched, they listened to the house. Hank joked, "If something wants in, it can come in the front." And Mark replied, "You do not mean that." And Hank said, "No, but I will keep the flashlight ready." They talked long into the small hours, exchanging small details in a ritual that is as human as a prayer. Mark said, "At 2:12 I heard a tap on the deck, like someone flicking their fingernail." And Hank answered, "That is so specific." And Mark said, "I know." And then it happened again. 3 slow taps, not random. They both stood and peered out. The silence made each sound shout. They shone lights and heard the grass give under something that did not step, but slid. The dogs flattened themselves against Mark's legs and would not move. The taps came again like a code. There were other noises too, a low dragging on the neighbor's fence, a rattling inside a paper bag stuck to the trash can handle. When Officer Ramirez did a courtesy drive through at dawn, he called from the porch and said, "Everything looks fine from here." But his voice had a curated brightness that meant he could not say what he saw in the slant of the yard. He asked, "Do you want me to file a report?" And Mark said, "Will that make it stop?" And the officer did not answer the way Mark wanted. Dr. Patel examined Roxy and Boone and said their cortisol was elevated and their paw path were roughened like they were walking on gravel, but they showed no external bites. The technical bit sounded clinical and small, and it did not explain the taps or the glass marks. Later, Miguel, who worked nights at a factory, said, "I have seen tracks where it should not be before." And Jenna said, "Tell me more." And Miguel described a print like a hand, but elongated, with knuckles that were wrong. They argued whether to bring in a tracker or a wildlife specialist. The tracker arrived, an old man named Tom, who smelled like smoke, and said, "I have been a tracker for 30 years. And then he spent more time at the threshold than out in the grass. Tom knelt and ran his fingers along the ground and said, "This is not a paw, not a deer. It is a weight and a drag." He looked up and said, "It left 2 pinpricks and something like a smear where it pressed its face." They set a trail camera high and aimed another one low under the deck. The low camera was taken down in the morning with the strap chewed through and the footage corrupted. That is a line I see in many of these reports, small failures that feel deliberate. If you have had an experience like this, tell the community. If you have ever had your dog refuse, yard, or a strange smell that will not go away, leave a comment starting with, "In my yard," so I can find it quickly. If you have a photo, write, "In my yard photo," and describe one odd detail. People who share their details help us see patterns. Your experience might help others recognize the small signals before they become something larger. Community stories guide these investigations and sometimes bring forward witnesses who are hesitant. But let us not get ahead of ourselves, because this neighborhood incident was only the first of 4 stories, and what came next shows how these things can migrate to the road and the open fields. The second report came from Jenna and her husband Miguel driving home late on a back road after a funeral. Their car was old, and the radiator had been temperamental that week. The night had fat stars and the smell of road tar from the recent repaving. Jenna said, "There was this heavy smell like wet fur and oil that rolled into the car when the window cracked." And Miguel answered, "Leave it open, it will clear." But the smell sat in the footwell like a creature. They pulled over because the engine stuttered and the dash lights started to blink. Miguel stepped out and popped the hood, and a sound hit them from the dark, like someone knocking the trunk in a measured rhythm, 3 taps slow and then 2 fast. Miguel looked over his shoulder and said, "Who would be on a road like this at this hour?" And Jenna said, "Maybe it is a drunk," but there was no headlight and no walking figure, only rustling in the cornrows that lined the shoulder. A semi-truck slowed, and a highway driver named Tara flashed her lights, then shouted across, "You need help," and she offered to call a tow. While they waited, Miguel said, "I can feel it, like a pressure at the base of my skull." And Jenna answered, "Me too." And then they both heard something slide along the hood like a heavy hand testing the shape of the car. Miguel slammed the hood down and turned the light on in time to see a silhouette, tall and narrow at the edge of the corn. And it moved with a crooked gait that did not match any deer. The driver of the semi, Hank from the earlier story, walked over and said, "I saw that, something that does not belong at here." And he had a gravelly voice like he had been awake too long. They described a face that seemed to catch light oddly, 2 luminous points where eyes would be, and a narrow snout that reflected like wet wood. The man in the truck offered to escort them to the next town, but when they looked in the rear view, the road behind them was untouched, as if nothing had stood there. A mechanic named Sam later checked the car and said, "There were scuffs on the paint, like something dragged a paw along it at elbow height, and the scratch pattern did not match branches." A local sheriff named Rosa made a report and wrote in the notes, "Unusual animal activity." The official said, "We get reports this time of year, but I will put it in as a suspicious circumstance." And the language did not satisfy Jenna, who wanted a name for what touched the trunk. The smell lingered in the upholstery for weeks as if it had soaked into the foam. They called it the road knock, and it became a story they told people at work. The conversation around that trunk hit an ordinary nerve that moves people from denial to attention. Miguel said, "When we started driving again, I kept thinking about the way it moved." And Jenna said, "Like a man, but not." And Miguel answered, "Yes, like it tried to copy us." People began to call it the mimic behavior in their messages to me. We move now from the roadside to the shelf of trees where hunters and hikers report the third set of encounters. This came from a caller named Tara who had organized a small hunting trip with friends, including Mark and another man named Alex. They were 3 people sleeping in a ramshackle cabin with 2 dogs tied outside a little ring of fire. Tara had an old habit of whistling a particular tune to call the dogs when they stray. One evening, as the wood and the fire guttered, she heard the whistle come back, but it was wrong. Tara said, "Someone imitated my whistle perfectly, but slower." And Alex said, "It sounded like you." And Tara said, "That is the thing. It did sound like me." They argued and laughed until Mark said, "Go look," and Alex stepped toward the tree line with a flashlight. The air smelled of resin and late-season mushrooms. The dogs growled low. Alex called, and the whistle answered from deep in the pines. Alex whispered, "That is not a bird." And Mark said, "I can hear it moving, like it is walking between trunks." When they shone lights, they saw a figure beyond the trees, half hidden by branches, that moved upright and then hunched like it was arranging its limbs. The figure had long arms and a narrow head, and when it shifted, it caught the light in the wrong places, making what looked like a face appear, schematic and too tidy. Alex said, "What is that?" And Tara answered, "It does not look like anything we should be seeing." And the dogs started to avoid the line of trees as if it had a gravity. In plain words, one of the dogs lifted a paw like it could not step, then retreated. They tried to take pictures, and the camera returned frames flooded with static, or images washed out, as if someone had held a light to the lens. They did not chase the thing. They made a plan to leave in the morning. But when they emerged, there were tracks in a soft patch of mud that were too long and had a narrow elongation at the toes. Mark crouched and counted 5 impressions with an extra scrape between them. He said,
This is not any foot I know. Alex wrapped his hands around a sapling and shivered. I felt it watching, like it was learning the outline of us. The backstory here matters because Tara was an experienced outdoors person who could name tracks and birds and plants. She sent me 3 photographs of the prints. They looked like an attempt at a foot. In a procedural aside, the group drove the prints to a state biologist named Dr. Patel, who examined the gait and said, "The stride is bipedal and too long for a human, but there is damage to the area consistent with a clavicle that is more flexible than ours." That technical note sounds impossible, and yet it is the kind of observation that creeps into official reports. It is not forensic in the sense of a police lab, but it is an attempt to map the mechanics of an anatomy that should not work. The 4th story comes from a wilderness camping excursion on the edge of a clear lake where a man named Luis and his friend Miguel set up a tent and planned a weekend of fishing. They were experienced enough to know how to read the wind and the water. The first night, a distant bellow cut the air so hollow that the dogs that were with them fell silent. Luis said, "It felt like the whole lake inhaled." And Miguel answered, "I heard something walk along the shore like heavy boots on dirt, though there were no boots and the shoreline was soft." They sat in the reflected light of their lantern and saw a shadow move along the far tree line, then stop and cock its head. Miguel mimicked the sound of a low bark, and the thing answered with a long rising note that sounded like a held vowel. Miguel said, "It sounded almost fluent, and it matched me." And Luis said, "Like it could copy us, like the road one." They kept watch all night, and toward dawn, the lantern light caught a pair of eyes at the tree line, 2 bright glints. The eyes did not blink. They felt as if someone was holding a flashlight trained on them, but there was no light. Luis stood to walk closer, and then a single large shape rose and walked along the bank in a way a man might do if he had to move silently but could not help bumping obstacles. The shape was upright and long-limbed, and when it passed a knot of reeds, the reeds lay flat as if someone pressed them with a palm. Miguel whispered, "It smells like a wet animal," and the air tasted
like green rot, and Luis answered, "My skin crawls." And then the dogs bolted away in a panic, forgetting their training. The 2 men chased after them and found that their bait bucket had been ripped open and the fish were gone. Later, they found deep gouges in a tree at head height and hair caught in the bark that was coarse and dark. They took a sample to a local vet, Dr. Patel, who said, "That hair is not domestic. It is coarse like a wild canine, but the follicle suggests a thicker hide." That methodical note sat beside the raw memory the friends kept, which was of being watched by a silhouette that copied and learned what it could. Across these 4 accounts, common threads emerge. Animals detect the change first. Strange odors precede the sighting by hours. Marks at glass, gouges on tree trunks, smears on patio doors, and 3 slow raps that tell a story of attention. The reports name similar mechanics, mimicry, and a bipedal frame that is too animal for a man and too human for a wolf. People describe eyes that catch the light like wet coins. They talk about an imitation of sound, a whistle copied back, a bark matched, and a human noise repeated out of rhythm. We also see a pattern of failed recording devices and slightly corrupted footage. People place cameras and either the footage is blank or distorted. I asked a technician named Sam what happens to cameras in his experience, and he said, "Cameras can be fooled by nothing as much as by something." In his words, sometimes the lens picks up infrared flicker, sometimes a battery fails, sometimes the footage shows a blur at the edge. That is the technical detail I can provide in simple terms. Echoing sensors fail to capture what human eyes remember. The process is frustrating. Simple gear checked, the memory card, the feed, the battery, the angle, and yet footage often yields nothing concrete. There are distinct moments of tension that changed how witnesses behaved. Moment 1 was the dogs refusing the threshold in Mark's backyard. That late-night scene tightened muscles and made the mundane dangerous. The smell set itself in the throat, and the 2 taps on the deck came like a small poem of attention. The evidence at the glass stuck in people as proof that it was tangible, even if invisible.
The second moment was the road knock on Miguel's trunk, where the touch on metal shifted the idea of safety while sitting inside a locked car. The third was the forest whistle that came like a stolen private sound and turned a controlled outing into a lesson in not assuming familiarity means friend. The fourth was the shoreline silhouette that moved with a crooked dignity and tested the boundary between a hunter and the hunted. Each of these moments lasted in their retellings a long time. People replayed the taps, the whistle, the knock, over and over.
Over, as if to catch a missed beat that would make sense. In the aftermath, witnesses made decisions that changed their routines. Mark stopped opening the back door at night. He left a porch light on and bought motion sensors, though they did not always trigger. Jenna started carrying a small bottle of antiseptic spray for the car seats, and Miguel took to checking the trunk with a stick before he sat down. Kara stopped whistling the tune she used to call her dogs. Louis and Miguel avoided camping near that lake for a season. These are small changes that add to a slow erosion of freedom. They chose pragmatic measures rather than sensational exposure. They did not set out to make viral videos. They wanted to sleep and to have their animals alive in the morning. The moral ambiguity sits there. You can take out cameras, buy lights, call the authorities. You can choose not to make it a spectacle. Each witness made a version of that choice. Now the epilogue. In time, because consequences do not stop at the close of the story. 1 month later, Mark replaced the back door glass with a laminated pane and installed a quieter latch. He began leaving the television on low at night so the house sounded occupied. He said, "It is a small comfort to think noise keeps attention away." And his neighbor Jenna painted the deck with an oil that masked smells and clipped the grass short. They wrote notes to each other like small maps of caution. 3 months later, the community as a whole had shared more reports. Officer Ramirez had filed an incident log, and the local news ran a brief about increased animal sightings. The vet clinic had more calls about pets acting anxious after dusk. A woman named Sarah from 2 blocks over posted a photo of a long print near her compost bin, and it matched the prints Tom the tracker had shown Mark. People began to swap timing and light patterns. They mapped the occurrences on a whiteboard at the hardware store where Hank worked, and someone took a photograph of the map and texted it to a former ranger named Ellie. 6 months on, the pattern had grown alarmingly consistent and yet embarrassingly unprovable. The county had not issued an alert. The only formal response was a cautious note recommending common wildlife precautions. Individually, people had shifted routes at night, avoided certain trails, and kept their dogs leashed. Collectively, they developed a vocabulary that included words like mimic, dogman, and shadow walker. Mark said in a message to me, "We talk about it like weather now, like something to consult before you plan an evening." That sentence holds more weight than a headline because it shows how fear becomes a new habit. In some ways, their lives compressed. In other ways, they became more alert neighbors trading tips. The epilogue is not clean. It is a slow rewrite of how people move through ordinary space. Throughout these 4 stories, there were named people who appeared as witnesses, helpers, or experts. Mark the homeowner, Roxy and Boone the dogs, Jenna the neighbor, Miguel the husband, Officer Ramirez the patrol, Sam the mechanic, Tom the tracker, Dr. Patel the veterinarian, Tara the hunter, Alex the friend, Luis the camper, Hank the semi-driver, and Ellie the ranger. Each person carried a small piece of the scene. They spoke, and their exchanges are part of what makes these accounts feel real. The dialogues are not neat lines written for drama. They are the halting back and forth of humans trying to keep a world they understood. When you listen to these stories, the temptation is to want a simple explanation. Perhaps it is an unknown animal. Perhaps it is a human playing a trick. Perhaps the mind fills with pattern. I am not here to tell you what to believe. I am here to show you what happened and how people changed afterward. The tape of events contains sensory anchors: smell, touch, sight, sound, and small physical traces that persist. That is what is left.
If you think you have seen something like any of this, please write to the comments and begin your message with "in my yard," or "on the road," or "in the woods," or "by the lake," so others can find similar posts quickly. Tell us the smallest detail, the smell, or the way a dog refused to step. Your detail might be the missing bead that connects to another account. If you want to report photographs, start your comment with "photo" and describe one odd element only. We are building a map, not a spectacle. Before you go, take a moment to subscribe if you want more eyewitness accounts and to help create a place where these voices can be gathered and respected. I will leave you with this final image, the one that keeps people awake the most. A low silhouette at the edge of light, a set of glints where eyes could be, and a slowing mimic of a human whistle. It is not loud or fast. It waits and learns. It notices the smallest cues. It does not need to hurry. As for me, I am more careful now about the back way I walk with my dog. I keep the porch light on in the early evenings. I listen when a neighbor says they heard 3 taps. I do not whistle near the trees. Maybe that is cowardice. Maybe that is wisdom. Maybe it is both. If you have a story, share it below. If you liked this collection, like and subscribe, and come back next week for another deep dive into the strange. Stay attentive to the sound that mimics you in the dark. I will be here.